Good afternoon, folks. It's Gord Cooke, Building Notes Canada. We'll be starting shortly. Just letting folks get online. Are you there, Stacy?
I am, Gord. How are you today?
Good. How are you?
Well, it's turning sunny out today, so we'll get lots of construction done today.
I like that too, right? Is it a good day to dig holes or not, right? A good day to roof or not? Yeah, it's interesting. I can't, oh, there we are. I see the participants. We have over 50 people already. That's wonderful. We have over 200 registered, I think you were saying, Stacy. So we'll wait just a little longer to get things started. Typically give people a few minutes to get going. I suspect some of you are regularly drop in on this series provided by Enbridge Gas. This is called the Advanced Building Science Series. This is part 2 of this year's sessions, if you will. This particular one's on carbon reduction strategies, and we have a pretty cool panel for you, expert panel, folks that have been doing this, or we would say are on top of this for you, and you get a chance to learn from them. I'm always mindful, Stacy, my partner in the U.S., Marc Liberté, at one time during college was a radio disc jockey, or at least a radio host, and he always said dead air was a big no-no, and to this day he can't stand dead air time, so he always likes to fill any dead air with banter. So I not that I necessarily want to take on conversation, but what's happening in your world? The Guelph Home Builders had a really nice awards banquet the other night. It was really cool to see people back and in touch with folks. And we actually had the Minister of Housing speaking, which was kind of interesting. Do you recall how that was received? Did you hear any feedback from the home builders?
No, it was a nice surprise to have the people there in attendance. And of course, Building Knowledge won for the service provider of the year. So congratulations to you guys.
Oh, thank you. I wasn't looking for the plug, but
No, I know you never are, Gord, but that's how it rolls. And there's a lot of well-deserved awards that were given out that night.
it is interesting that many of the award winners in all of the categories were net zero builders who are at least doing net zero as an option. I guess we could say Guelph's a bit of a hotbed for that anyway, so perhaps no surprise. But
we are ground zero for net zero, I always say.
Fair enough. What was most interesting to me, and I don't know if folks would remember, but the name Jim Keating, Keating Construction from Elora. Jim received his 60th anniversary as a member of the Home Builders Association. He was one of the founding members of the Guelph Home Builders Association, and he was recognized for his 60th year of active service in the home builders. And Jim was one of the first builders I ever met, one of the first Star 2000 builders I worked with way back in the 80s. And he was there, he and his wife Fran, and I got to tell you, I was just giddy with excitement. And Jim was he said, I'm still working, Tom, his son's got me working in the back in the trim shop. He's 84 years old, I think, and he's still proudly working in the building industry. I thought, well, that's a great tribute to the building industry.
Trudy's on the chat saying that she loved watching you dance with your wife at the past events.
Ah, thank you, Trudy.
We don't do that anymore, I know.
I know we don't do that anymore. But the real star of that was George Mila and his wife. They were truly excellent dancers. I don't know if Trudy remembers them, but thank you, Trudy, for remembering. So we're at roughly 90, close to 100 participants,
Yeah,
and we're
let's
at
get
10.
started, Gord. Yeah, let's get started.
Let's get started. We're at 104. So again, I'll say welcome and thank you for attending the Enbridge Gas Provincial Advanced Building Science Series. We are very pleased to partner with Enbridge on this. Most of you will recognize that Enbridge is a great industry partner. This particular session, as I said, is part two. It's a session on carbon reduction strategies for Canadian homes, and this expert panel, which includes, you'll see on the screen, our keynote, I guess we'll call it, Chris Magwood, who's previously with the Endeavor Center, now with the Rocky Mountain Institute. I'll introduce him in a little bit. And then from the Home Builders Association itself, we have Sonja Winkelmann and Frank Lohmann. And then two builders that have been very active on this, Minto Construction, Carl Pawlowski, and from Doug Terry Homes, Miyoko Oikawa. And it's really cool to have this sort of well-rounded, very short format, of course, hour and a half, but interesting to get going. As I said, we're always interested and always very thankful of Enbridge's participation. I don't know, I can't see if Susan's on the call or not, but this is all headed up by a great industry friend, Susan Cuddy. He's the supervisor of strategic builder relationships. And Susan supervises that team across the province of Ontario and specializes in business development within the construction industry. And most importantly, at least from our perspective, very respectful and helpful with respect to carbon reduction, energy efficiency for the last 20 or 30 years, and now in terms of carbon reduction. So we really appreciate Enbridge's involvement and helpful sponsorship of the efforts of the industry to improve technically. And then Stacy, you're going to walk us through just some of the housekeeping rules.
Yeah, so just to reiterate how Zoom works, at the bottom of your screen, you will have a chat room, which, as you can see how Trudy has used it already, just for general conversation with your fellow participants or with the host and the panelists. And if you have a true question about the material that's presented here today, please put that in the area that says Q&A, because then we see it and it gets answered and it gets stored in the recording. So that recording you will also receive at the end of at least by the end of next week. It depends on how much more resource material we want to include in with this presentation today. And I see that David Spencer is raising his hand. So David, we have that feature if it's based on something that is relevant to the material, but you still have to be able to put something in the Q&A if it's a question, because we don't have everyone able to speak during the presentation or be seen, just to keep things moving along. So apologies for that, but it's for ease of presentation and to keep things flowing. So be respectful, be considerate in the chat. It's not a place to plug your business at all. It's not for that kind of forum. And then at the end of this whole presentation, the Survey Monkey survey comes out to you, and we just ask that you take the 3 minutes to fill that out. It helps us build upon these webinars to deliver information that is relevant to what you're working on. And Gord, is there anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think we're fine in terms of housekeeping. And you did say that all the links and presentations will be sent out. And so Stacy, if you wouldn't mind just running quickly the polls.
Okay. So we're going to find out first where you guys are all listening to. If you're coming from a different province or right here in Ontario, we want to hear where you are listening to us from. And I know most of us are from Ontario, but I don't even know where our own speakers are from, to be honest, Gord.
Well, yes, for the most part from Ontario, yes.
Okay. We have an eclectic group of professionals that you have encountered. I never know where they're going to come from.
Fair enough.
So as you suspected, it's mostly from Ontario. Some BC folk joining us.
Can you show the results?
Yeah, once I end the poll, then no one
yes.
else can answer anything. So we're doing pretty good. We got 84%. Okay, so we're going to share the results so you can see.
And I noticed we have a typo on the screen. Isn't that interesting?
Did I make a typo?
Where are you from, it says.
Ah, where are you located?
Warehouse, yeah. Well, great. Thank you, folks. And
Okay.
it is interesting to see the BC folks on the call. Thank you, folks, for getting up early. I'm kidding a little bit, but it's
Oh,
only 10 o'clock there.
so you do have one from Texas. Armando's calling.
Oh, Armando. Thank you, Armando. Armando always listens in. What a great guy.
uh, and then the second poll, we always like to find out what your occupation that brings you here today to listen into the webinar. You have Tim Yondo from Vermont as well.
Wow. Thanks, Tim. We consider Vermont pretty much Canada. So.
Sure. I'm curious. Yeah, there's quite a few filling out the other. So if we haven't found the right title for you here, yes, please put it in the other category. That would be great. Thanks.
Maybe manufacturers could be, right?
Yeah, we do seem to have a lot from the government sector as well, which is
Ah,
nice. I think it's good for them to stay informed with what's going on.
very nice.
I see Lori Belanger in there. She's always on top of stuff there now that she's a site, what is it, a site plan reviewer? Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Lori can correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, so we'll end the poll and share those results.
Oh, yeah, quite a few in the other. Isn't that interesting?
We'll
And
see if I
thank
can
you.
adopt that.
It is showing this wide range of a relatively new topic, right? Carbon is kind of interesting. I guess we should close that up and we should get started. But it is pretty interesting to us, this idea of, I look at the carbon counting as being very similar to where we were with energy back in the late 80s, early 80s. So it'll be really interesting to see how we get moving with that. And there's the chat telling us, yes, thank you. Whoops, sorry. There we are. I don't know why I can't get rid of the chat. Oh, my apologies. I'm not, there we are. There. So here's our agenda for today rather quickly. Chris Magwood will speak first and set the stage on some of the reporting metrics for carbon. Then we have Carl from Minto talking about a builder's approach, and similarly Miyoko from Doug Terry Homes giving us the builders, the way they've been approaching this concept. And then we have from the Home Builder Association itself, Frank Lohmann and Sonja, to think about what you as builders and folks in the industry need to be planning for in terms of energy, carbon, resiliency, and so on. And then we have lots of time for questions. We may overrun just a little bit, but we'll have lots of time for questions at the end. So we will take questions at the end. I'll remind you, as Stacy said, put your questions in the Q&A. That lets us manage those questions much better. So make sure you do that. And then in terms of our presenters, I won't read the whole thing, but Chris Magwood is currently with the Rocky Mountain Institute's Embodied Carbon Initiative. You may recall Chris was the director and teacher at the Endeavor Center up until recently. He helped establish the Builders for Climate Action, and has been a leading developer of the Beam Carbon Estimator tool. So very, very active in this space, and really has carved out a leadership position in this. He's authored over 7 books on sustainable building. And just as you can see here, the third last bullet, back in the day, he was doing work on straw bale as well, graduate of Trent University. So Chris will be our first speaker. Following Chris, we'll have Carl Pawlowski who's the sustainability professional with Minto Communities. He is, as you'll see here, working actively on projects like the Toronto Green Standard, Tier 2, lead for buildings, the wellness program, CHPs, Net Zero, Energy Star, so on and so on. And he's also active in Minto Community's first high-rise geoexchanger project at their North Oak community in Oakville. Kind of cool. Miyoko, you'll remember her name. She was, for a number of years, the technical director, at least responsible for the technical files related to provincial and national code at the Ontario Home Builders. And now, though, she is specifically with Doug Terry Homes as the manager of research and innovation. But again, it brings a wide range of really good technical background for the building industry. So we're really pleased to have Miyoko with us. And then again, many of you will recognize Sonja Winkelmann. Sonja's been working in the field of energy efficiency for over 17 years, been with CHBA since 2014, and has led the development of the Net Zero Home labeling program, which is so cool that CHBA took that on. And previous to that, she was the executive director of the Net Zero Energy Home Coalition. So a long background there. And then I'm most pleased to have Frank Lohmann on the call. Frank was a certified journeyman carpenter back in Germany, and then worked for 23 years for the National Research Council in Canada, and joined as the director of building science, CHB, in 2020. So cool to have him on the builder's side, or on the builder's team. It just shows the commitment, I would say, that CHBA has made to ensuring this path forward, this true technical path forward of these voluntary programs. I think that's so cool that we'll work towards that. So with that, I'll stop sharing, and we'll turn it over to Chris. Please, Chris, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. I'll just get these slides up. There we go. Okay. Well, I'm really glad to be kicking off this session. This is a great panel, a really good collection of folks been thinking about this topic for a long time. So I'm going to start by setting a bit of framework from the work that I've been doing with the Builders for Climate Action group, which has been looking very closely at what the material related emissions side of a carbon-free building would look like, trying to understand where those emissions are, how to reduce them, and doing some work to sort of figure that out on homes in the Canadian context. So I'm going to very quickly start with stuff that people already kind of know, but it's a good, I think, context for looking at the materials. Is obviously, as Gord mentioned, since the 80s, there's been a pretty strong movement, and it's built over those decades to address the operational efficiency of the buildings. And over the last decade, and in particular the last sort of 5 years, thinking about that energy efficiency, not just from the point of view of the amount of energy being used, but the amount of emissions associated with that energy. And so a couple of our studies that I'm going to talk about looked at the energy models from the buildings that we then examined the material emissions for. And as you probably will all be aware, a sort of, in this case, a typical Toronto's two-story home that has both gas and electricity in its energy mix, and is built to our sort of current code minimums for efficiency, has a relatively high carbon footprint operationally. This example that I'm showing you here is 3.5 tons of emissions per year, which equates to sort of 70 tons over 20 years. And in the models that Enercan provided us for these buildings in this study, if we kept the same code minimum energy efficiency, but switched that building to, in this case, an all-electric version with heat pumps, that 70 tons over 20 years comes down to 14.2 tons over 20 years. And if we take that same electrified building and make it a much more high efficiency building, in this case meeting tier 5 of the National Building Code, we bring that down to just under 9 tons of emissions over the same 20-year period. So, on the operational side, there's been lots of people working on this, and we know, these are the pathways that we can take to reduce the operating emissions side. But the work that I've been doing and that I'm going to present today is looking at this orange bar. We know that before somebody moves into a building and starts operating it, there are a bunch of emissions associated with harvesting and transporting and manufacturing the materials that are going to go into the building. But until we know what that number is, we don't really know what that building's carbon footprint is at 20 years. We know what the operational part is, but really what we want to know is, what are these two things together? And so the work that we've been doing is trying to figure out, what is this orange bar, so that we know what the total carbon footprint of that home is going to be in 20 years, 30 years, whatever the time frame we're looking at. And we've taken at Builders for Climate Action to calling this carbon use intensity, because it's sort of if we combine these two numbers, we get a sort of single metric that we can use to try to hit or measure our progress against national, provincial, and municipal targets for carbon reductions. So it's been an exciting year at Builders for Climate Action. Over the past year, we've worked on 3 really great studies, all attempting to sort of answer the question of, how big is that orange bar? What do these material carbon emissions actually look like? So in the next few minutes, I'm very quickly going to kind of condense the results of a study we did of 190 model homes in 5 cities for Enercan, and then one in Nelson and Castlegar, BC, where we looked at 34 as-built homes. And then we just wrapped up this one, the Embark study for the GTHA, which looked at just over 500 as-built homes. So, we're starting to feel like, okay, we've now looked at a lot of homes in the Canadian context, and we're starting to get a sense of, what this orange bar actually looks like. So we'll start talking about that. Just to give you a sense of how these numbers are generated, I'll keep this really short because this isn't about how we do these calculations, but I just want you to know that the calculations come from these reports called EPDs, Environmental Product Declarations, which are an ISO standardized way of reporting on emissions from manufactured products and materials. We then have a database of building related EPDs in our tool that we call BEAM. And so that has all of these EPDs and the data in them. And we can sort of model a building very similar to the way an energy modeling program works. It's got kind of all the data and assumptions in the background, and then you put in the specifics about a particular building, and you get an answer of what is the material carbon emissions in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it kind of puts all the different greenhouse gases into one metric. So at a really high level, this is what we found when I kind of summarize all 3 of these studies, that at the high end, homes in Canada can have anywhere from sort of 300 to over 560 kilograms of emissions per square meter of heated floor area. And so if you think about the sort of the upper end of that, literally half a ton of emissions per square meter of floor area, there's clearly no way that we meet any targets around climate action when homes are emitting at that kind of extent. The average figures from these studies, so if we kind of took all the results from all the homes in all the studies, these were the averages. It was interesting that the Enercan study and the Nelson study actually ended up at the exact same average of 150 kilograms of emissions per square meter. And the Embark study in the Toronto region was a little bit higher at 191, but with almost 700 buildings in having been run through BEAM at this point, that's like a fairly close cluster of averages, and so it gives us a sense of where overall the industry is kind of at right now from an average point of view. And then we got some great results at the lower end, buildings with quite low emissions. One of the buildings at the Enercan study kind of falling almost at 0, just at 2 kilograms per square meter. A great example from Nelson at 72, and even in the GTHA where the average was a bit higher, there was a few homes that came right in at this 115, 116 range at the low end. So, a really, the thing that really stands out there is there's a wide possibility of results. And from the as-built homes, we see that they literally do land kind of all over that scatter. And so what we want to do is figure out, how do we address that now that we know what some of those numbers are. Also, wanted to point out that there were some pretty great results in the Enercan study, a building that was actually net carbon storing, and a building in an as-built home in Nelson that was at that rate of 2 kilograms per meter squared. The NRCan study is of model homes. So this was like a theoretically you could achieve 2, but in Nelson, we actually found a builder there who had achieved that as a result. So I'm going to quickly look at some of the results from Nelson, because I think there we had as-built homes. We did the modeling of the materials. We had their HOT 2000 models on the performance, the operational side. And so, you know, it's really interesting to see how those things fit together using these real world examples. So in Nelson, of those 34 homes we looked at, as-built homes, the average was just under 29 tons of emissions from the materials in those homes. And at the high end, we had a house at 63.6, and at the low end, we had a house at 5.9. So, you know, again, you can see there's a wide range of results there. But what I wanted to look at is not just the material side, but also the operational side. So if we took the average in Nelson of all the materials and the average operational emissions, this is what the picture looked like. That 28.8 tons for materials and just over 1.25 tons per year operationally. So if we're looking for the carbon footprint of that home, that average home in Nelson over 20 years, it's 54 tons. And that means that it's going to take 23 years of operating that home before the operational emissions have equaled the material emissions. And that, you know, really drives home how important it is when we're trying to meet climate reduction goals by a certain time, you know, within the next decade or two. That upfront piece that's in the materials is going to be the bigger piece in Nelson. And from the higher end of Nelson, this wasn't the house with the highest carbon footprint, but it was sort of like a high carbon footprint house, also with a high carbon operational piece to it. So the house had 40.7 tons of emissions from its materials and just under 5 tons a year from its operations. And at the scale that I made this diagram at, it actually falls off the scale. In 20 years, it's just under 140 tons, 138.7 in the 20 years. So that's way over what the that average showed us. And in this case, when the operational emissions are high, they'll equal that material emissions in just 8 years. So you know, the lens you might look at this building through will change, because clearly here reducing the operating emissions will have a greater impact on that 20-year carbon footprint than when it's a bit lower. And here we see the other end of the spectrum. This was a low carbon materials house at 12.9 tons, but its operations were very low at 0.18 tons a year. So that's an electrified home on the BC grid, which is quite clean. So that means that this building only has 16.5 tons of emissions in total over 20 years. So, you know, looking at those carbon use intensity numbers, my feeling is, you know, that's what we need to be looking at, and that's what we need to be comparing. And the interesting thing about using that carbon use intensity metric is that's where we get to figure out for that location, you know, for that particular house in that climate with whatever energy sources are available, you know, what's the best way to address it. And sometimes it's going to be through energy efficiency, sometimes it's going to be through materials, and most often it's going to be, you know, trying to do a combination of both of those things, but all in the effort to try to get, you know, the total emissions, that carbon use intensity, down as low as possible. So in this case, you know, it's going to take 92 years before the operational emissions equal the material emissions. And so, you know, you've passed the point of diminishing returns from making this building more efficient. Here, you're going to want to think about the materials mostly. So again, just to sort of reiterate, the carbon use intensity that we're talking about is, you know, all the emissions associated with making the materials plus the emissions associated with operating the building is the carbon use intensity. And there's those 3 results, and that shows a pretty wide spectrum, given that, you know, those are all new homes built in the same region in Nelson, BC over the last couple of years. The fact that you know, we can have everything from a super low carbon use intensity to a very high one, and sort of everything in between means that, you know, that's the kind of metric that I think we need to be focused on. Also interesting from the Nelson study is because we knew which level of the BC step code those houses were at, we were able to see what was the correlation between the material emissions and the operating emissions. And what we found was there was really no correlation. So, you know, a step 1 house, which is, you know, the minimum energy efficiency, you know, one of the step 1 houses was at the higher end of material carbon emissions, and one was almost at the very low end. And so, you know, clearly you can make a step 1 house that ends up at either end of the spectrum. And same thing, we have got step 3 homes at the top and at the bottom. We've got step 4 homes at the top and the bottom. And the 2 step 5 homes, you know, sort of landed squarely in the middle, but under the average for material emissions. So what this really says is this is not a game of either or. We're not, you know, we don't need to think about these things as opposing goals. It's not, well, we either have to address the operational efficiency or we have to address the material efficiency. We can actually do both, and we can do both well, and we can see examples of that in this study, or we could do them both badly, and we can see examples of that. So, you know, it's not a predictor. The more energy efficient you make the building doesn't necessarily drive up the material emissions. They're based on the materials you choose. And if you choose low carbon materials, you can still make a really high efficiency home that ends up with a really great carbon use intensity figure. So one of the last points that I'll make before passing this on is that, you know, I find this really encouraging from the 2 studies of as-built homes that, you know, here in the GTHA, there are some builders whose business as usual is 40% less carbon emissions than the average in that region. And this is not a builder who was thinking about trying to make a low carbon building. They had no idea that this was the result that they were achieving, and yet they're achieving it. So what that tells me is pretty much every builder, you know, could be knocking, you know, 40% off of their material carbon emissions total without any great hurdles in front of them, because there are already people doing that, and there's already people for whom that is their business as usual. And then we see the same in Nelson, that there's a builder out there, you know, also a production builder, also making, you know, a home for sale, also concerned about code compliance and affordability, and their business as usual is, you know, 50% better than the average for that region. So there's a lot of low-hanging fruit when we think about material carbon emissions, and, you know, these as-built studies really point out that low-hanging fruit is there. And so where is that low-hanging fruit? Well, in both studies, we found that concrete, insulation, and cladding were the lion's share of emissions from homes. Slightly different percentages between Nelson and Toronto, but they were the 3 leading categories in both places. So, you know, if we are going to chase after reducing these material-related emissions, those are the places that we're going to get the biggest return from addressing. And in the Toronto study, we did that. We took one of the as-built homes. It had a pretty high carbon footprint, 262 kilograms of emissions per square meter. And we applied a handful of changes in those high impact areas. We changed to the lowest carbon concrete mix that's available in the region. We swapped out insulation types for these 2 graphs, one in the wall cavity and the roof insulation, and one here on the continuous insulation. We replaced the brick cladding with a lower carbon option, in this case, engineered wood. And for the flooring and the drywall, we didn't change the type of material. We just changed to the brands with the best carbon performance in their category. And that knocked 75% of the emissions from the materials of that one home. And so, you know, I think that's another great example of just how much low-hanging fruit there is on the material side in this sector of the construction industry. The final result I'm going to share with you, because I think it's also interesting, we took the same material substitutions and applied them to a home from the Toronto study that already started with a much lower carbon footprint. So instead of 81 tons of emissions associated with the house, it started with only 33. If we applied all these same material switches to it, we ended up at 56.5 kilograms per square meter. The previous model I showed you showed it up at 66. So it's like once we sort of find the places where the materials are going to make a big difference, doesn't really matter what the house is or the design of it or anything like that. If we sort of apply a good material palette to it, we get to almost the same result. No matter where we started from, it looks like, oh, so somewhere in this range, 50 to maybe 70 kilograms per square meter is really achievable in terms of what's possible without too big a change to our business as usual approach. And so that's, given that our average now is somewhere between 150 and 190, getting down into the 50, 60, 70 kilogram per square meter range is a huge improvement. And I think, yeah, my last slide is just to sort of, encourage us all to think about this as something that you can do in bite-sized steps. You don't have to leap from your current practice into, zero carbon or carbon storing territory on the materials side. If you think about a 10-year plan that looks at knocking 10% of the material emissions per year off those homes, then that's a 10-year plan to getting down to zero. And given that it's only a handful of material changes make such a big difference, I think there's a way to sort of really strategically plan out a path where you kind of tackle the parts of your buildings that have the most emissions associated with them, and then you're kind of just like working your way up the tree from the absolute lowest hanging fruit, and working higher and higher, but thinking about it as a strategy that you can actually plan out over a period of time and not just have to sort of leap into full bore and quickly. And so that is it for my bit. And
thank you, Chris.
Yeah, we can pass it off to Carl.
Carl, we'll get you up and running if you wouldn't mind. If you could share your slides. And just one quick question, we'll answer most of the questions later, but the quick question was, what's the base code used in your studies, US or Canadian code? This comes from Armando in Texas. I presume you were using National Building Code as your base, or was it the Ontario Building Code?
It was the National Building Code in the NRCan study and the Nelson study. Yeah.
Fair enough. And so, Armando, that would be the 2015 National Building Code of Canada, which would be roughly equal to, somebody's going to argue with me on this a little bit, but roughly equal to the 2015 IECC as a rough comparison point. And again, we'll answer the other questions later, but I thought I'd give that one to Armando quickly. And next we have Carl from Minto Communities, speaking about the carbon reduction strategies for Canadian homes and how Minto has interacted with that. Carl, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Gordon and Chris. Thanks for that perfect transition there and segue. It's almost as if it was planned. So yeah, Gord and Andy at Building Knowledge, thanks for reaching out, asking us to share our perspective. I'm going to mostly focus on embodied carbon. That's sort of the hot topic right now. And I'm going to take it from a sort of strategic approach and share sort of where we've come from, where we are today, and sort of what we're looking forward to in the future. So not surprisingly, we've come from primarily a focus on operational energy efficiency, more recently getting into operational carbon counting, and we're really just getting into that space where we're developing a more thoughtful and comprehensive strategy, not just around carbon emissions, but environmental, social, governance issues more broadly. So, that historical focus, we've looked at things like Energy Star, LEED, more recently Net Zero Ready and Full Net Zero. We have a long history of sort of pilot projects going back to 1992, looking at, higher efficiency homes. And, I'm not going to go through all these here, but you can see a number of milestones over the years. Most notably is 2021, we formalized a corporate ESG strategy. And this is really the mechanism that we are using to drive action in a number of areas. And a way that we sort of determined what our key focus areas are is to do what we've called a ESG materiality matrix. And you can see the chart on the right here. We asked, people in the industry, subject matter experts, our own internal and external stakeholders. So that included employees, board members, residents, customers, and just more broadly, stakeholders that we impact. And you could see in the top right there, carbon emissions and climate resilience were the top two targets on focus areas of significance on this chart here. So what that means is it's both important from an industry research perspective, but also it's important to our stakeholders and the people that we work with and impact. More broadly, our ESG strategy also includes things like cybersecurity, ethics, diversity and inclusion, health and safety, affordability. So it's a much more broad strategy, but it's in place to keep momentum, keep people focused, and really keep us moving towards where we need to be in the future. ESG may not be a new concept to most of the folks here, but really it looks at three key areas: business resilience, community impact, and environmental impact. So you can find more on our website if you're interested in going to the details there, but I just wanted to share high level what's driving everything that we're doing. And then next I'm going to get into specifically what we're doing as it relates to embodied carbon. So the question, where are we today? We're still really trying to understand the issue, right? We know certain things, and certain people in the organization may be more knowledgeable, but we also need to disseminate that knowledge throughout the business. We're a large builder with lots of employees, lots of trades, lots of partners that we work with. But generally, we know, as Chris mentioned, focus on the structure and enclosure. We know that's 60 to 70% of embodied carbon. And as Chris also mentioned, and something that we've learned, over the last year or two, is that, building high performance doesn't always correlate to that higher embodied carbon. There's some commentary going around that if you build net zero, you're automatically going to increase the embodied carbon in the home. And what we've seen is that's not necessarily true. The second thing that we're doing today is to really understand our baseline. So where do we currently stand as it relates to embodied carbon in each product type, each structure type, and envelope type across all of our geographies. And I'm mixing in both part 3 and part 9 discussions here because that's what we build. So I don't want to fully isolate those two. And we operate in Ottawa, GTA, Calgary, Florida, South Carolina. So we want to understand across our entire portfolio where do we stand. The third thing that we're doing, and some of the studies that Chris had mentioned, we've provided support to, and we find that really valuable, both for the industry and for us as a builder. But really, supporting industry through that collaboration, sharing information and data, and both sharing the challenges that we're facing and any achievements that we've had. And then the fourth is looking at some of those easier changes that we can make today. So looking at projects that are currently in design, what can we do with the concrete, what alternative insulation types are out there, and then looking at cladding and window frame options as well. And the window frame comment is mostly for part 3 construction. You can see on the right side, we've done some studies. This is from a high-rise building, and it's pretty much in line with what you'd expect and what we've seen in some of the other studies in terms of what are the key materials that are contributing to it. And you can see some of these numbers are fairly consistent with what Chris had presented as well. And last, I'm going to touch on. Oh,
Did you mean to stop sharing?
no, sorry, the PowerPoint crashed there. Give me 1 second here. Apologies. There we go. Is that back up?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. The last thing I'm going to touch on is sort of looking to the future. Where do we need to go? First, we need consistent metrics and methodologies. And again, I think Chris presented a lot of those. The BEAM tool as a tool to measure embodied carbon, and then looking at the metrics, he got into a little bit of detail on MCE, MCI, carbon use intensity. So I think we've got a lot of those tools today. We just need to increase the adoption and how many people are using these tools across the industry. The second point, target setting. We're looking towards reporting on embodied carbon and disclosing that publicly to again share and share with the industry. I think there's value in having voluntary thresholds being set. And all of that will help drive towards some of those long-term changes, that sort of 10-year strategy that Chris was mentioning. And I look at the right-hand side here. These are actual targets that we have set as part of our ESG strategy around embodied carbon. And this is over the next number of years leading up to 2025. You can see we've piloted a embodied carbon analysis for one project that I spoke about briefly. And then we've got these remaining targets over the next number of years. So do one in each geography, measure and specifically identify alternatives for a minimum of 3 materials. And then eventually, once we have that good information that we can base decisions on, we will look at incorporating at least one embodied carbon alternative from one of those most intensive categories. And eventually that will lead us to setting solid embodied carbon targets for our projects. And we set these for to be completed at least by 2025, but we might do it sooner, right? The third point is around municipalities, manufacturers, suppliers, and trades. There's been discussions around the impacts of zoning and planning policy. So minimum parking requirements, minimum setback requirements that add to sort of structural concrete elements. Chris mentioned, requesting EPDs to help build capacity and apply pressure in the industry. So that's something that we want to do moving forward and encourage others to do. And again, building that internal knowledge and strength, both with our employees and our trade partners. And my last point that'll leave it at, and this is something that, has come up in discussions with Gord and the building knowledge team, is as we're making these alternative or implementing alternative materials, don't forget good building science.
Thanks for that, Carl. Obviously, we're building science enthusiasts. We all take our information from, I would say, the grandfathers of that. I don't think he wants to be called a grandfather, but the John Straubs, the Joe Stiebricks, and so on. So we just want to make sure we get the science right. So thank you for that. Thanks very much, Carl. Great start from a builder's perspective, and we'll hand it over to Miyoko if you wouldn't mind stop sharing. There are some questions in the chat for you as we move along, but we'll save those till the end. And Miyoko, if you're there, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen, thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. So Miyoko Oikawa, I'm here on behalf of Doug Terry Limited, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about our journey, which is going to sound very similar to what Carl just talked about, but that's okay, because it does kind of show you that at different companies of different sizes, you can take first steps to begin exploring carbon. So if you're not familiar with Doug Terry Limited, we're a builder based out of St. Thomas, Ontario. We specialize in low rise, but we've recently gotten into mid-rise, high performance buildings. We build net zero ready as standard as of 2019. And just to add that we're not only a builder, but we're a research collaborator. We have started our own mobile panelization company, LC Manufacturing. We have our own aero barrier company, HVAC company, and developing a sustainable survivability framework called LifeArc. So some of this work on carbon will play into that as well. So we believe that to understand where we're going, we need to understand where we're at. We've spent quite a few years working with building knowledge to work towards net zero ready. So again, building that to standard on our low-rise buildings. We had to work really hard on our basics. As Carl said, working on basics of building science. So really good air tightness strategy, water management, passive design with our buildings, understanding our operational carbon, and moving towards sort of this future idea of what else can we do? Where do we go from net zero ready? So we're used to being on the bleeding edge, again, not as big a company as Minto, but just showing that regardless of the size, when you want to move to that next step, it's definitely possible. We're already sort of at the point where we need to think of what's coming down the pipeline in terms of code or municipal regulations, or even just what do we need to provide from an environmental standpoint. Building on our understanding of operational is providing this understanding of embodied carbon. So we've engaged Chris Magwood to investigate this, the material carbon emissions for our low-rise archetypes. And that's really looking at 3 different model types. So I have them here. We have a bungalow, a semi, and our 2-story. And what we've had Chris do is use his beam tool to get a baseline for these prototypes for material carbon emissions, and looking at this idea of a near-term solution, the 1 to 2 years, a medium term, and a future scenario. And the reason why I really like this approach that Chris uses is that it moves it into more digestible targets, so that near 1-to-1 substitution are simple changes that we can implement in the near future, and then moving towards that 2 to 5, and then that 5 to 10. And as we move into that future scenario, getting an idea of what types of changes we would have to make that could be quite impactful. So when we think of those future scenarios, is it, building buildings that don't have basements? So we're removing the amount of concrete that we're using in the buildings, more significant types of changes to our design. Whereas the near or medium could just be in the types of materials that we're using, and not doing huge changes to those prototypes and the look and aesthetic of the building that we're building, while maintaining proper building science. So again, the air, water, and energy targets that we already have. So then from the information that we got from Chris, we're now digesting it, getting a better understanding of what's going into our buildings, what some of those changes can be, how they would affect our energy consumption, or just the performance of our enclosure if we were to make the changes, and then starting to put together some of those near-term targets. So what did we learn so far? If we look at the 3 different archetypes, we can see that even in the first 1 to 2 years, we're seeing a significant reduction in our material carbon emissions just by making those easy substitutions. And then as we move to the medium and future, we can get to this near eliminating material carbon emissions point if we were to make some sort of serious changes. I don't think we are at the point of stating that we are going to move towards that right now, but I think it's really important for us to have an understanding of what that looks like in the upcoming years, especially if we do start to see those municipal or provincial regulations come down, and understanding ahead of time what changes we would have to make. We've also learned some low-hanging fruit, which I think Chris did show in his slides as well. So reducing the amount of concrete brick, changes in insulation types, or maybe the concrete mixes we're using. I think this will also start to have a bigger impact on suppliers and the types of products that they have. If we start to look at material carbon emissions more closely as an industry, could move towards different product types in the future. Some of those near future changes can result in 50% reduction, as was shown on the previous slide. And again, just painting a really good picture of what we need to do in the future scenarios. We do have a lot of questions I think, as we look towards where the industry is at, and do as a company feel that it's important for us to participate in this type of research, whether it's benchmarking or just sharing of the data within the industry or with policymakers. And that's really because we feel that there's an insufficient knowledge capacity throughout Part 9 construction, especially when you compare that to Part 3 construction and where they're at with carbon emissions. So I think on the Part 9 side, there's kind of a lot of like, what the heck is carbon, and who should care, and why. We do think that further research is required, and alignment of tools across Part 3 and Part 9. Just some questions: if there were to be targets implemented, what are the tools? If I use a different tool, do I get the same output? If they're absolute targets, can I reach them with several different tools? Who's going to manage those and the databases? We want to reduce the variation between the outputs of those and just gather more data. So I think you've heard from Minto, you've heard from us. We're already, again, doing sort of advanced high performance buildings. So do the results kind of spread across builders who may just be building code, and for different areas within Canada? Questions for policymakers, again, if we move towards key tools that are used in the industry, who's going to be responsible for database management and upkeep, and how do we take new information and feed it into the databases for those tools? What role will municipalities play in target setting? How will you incentivize participation? I think a lot of the Part 9 industry is kind of just waiting and seeing, and there could be some significant impacts if you go that route instead of providing information early. And how will this affect current or future energy targets? And can there be a good balance between energy and carbon reduction? And that's really it for me.
Thank you, Miyoko. I think it's really interesting, as you said, you guys are on the bleeding edge. There's a large company, Minto, or a larger company. You guys are quickly becoming a large company. To see that level of commitment, and it ties pretty nicely, obviously, into the next. And Sonja and Frank, I'm sure you must be really pleased to see builders who are willing to bleed, as Miyoko said, and offer up to the industry this early research. So thank you very much for that. And Miyoko, again, in the chat, there's questions that'll relate to some of the questions you asked as well. So hopefully we can find some answers for folks. So Frank, if you wouldn't mind, I think Frank's sharing screen. We still have Miyoko showing up on the screen.
Yeah. Apologies, I was looking for my unmute button. It moved location when I shared my screen. Okay, so yes, thanks, Gord, for the introduction earlier, for the kind words you had for me. Also, just a quick introduction for CHPA. We represent about more than 9,000 member companies across Canada. The technical information from the groups that Sonja and I work for is used by many of the provincial and local and regional home builders association. But let me also put my contribution here today in the right context with what we've heard so far from Chris and Carl and Miyoko. Every time I listen to Chris, I'm learning new things, and it's really great to have simple to understand tools and actionable knowledge as we're all looking for the next step. And along the same line, it's great to know that best practice builders are already applying these metrics and findings in their projects, as you just said, Gord. And so congratulations to all the panelists that have come here before me. It's quite humbling for me to be here. And I can't probably add much value in terms of the building science or carbon discussion on the technical side, but I'd like to focus on the title, the one word in the title that says beyond. Where do we go, carbon and beyond, and put a little bit of a broad lens approach to the entire subject. In other words, I'd like to maybe share some thoughts on how we can move the entire industry forward sustainably and affordably and safely. So I first thought I suggest a few questions. Let me just see here. As a background for this presentation, the images you saw in the background there are from the Net Zero Housing Excellence Awards from 2021. Those are the CHPA award winners. I treated them as my near future horizon for this for this discussion to get the entire residential construction industry, including renovators, to this point. I realize they're not net zero everything, but they could represent a good starting point for the entire industry. And for starters, I thought I explored these questions that you see on the screen now. So one of them is, can we achieve climate effective home construction by simply adding carbon when we're done with energy efficiency and then add resilience? But then also the more important question maybe is how can all builders and renovators make it all work together? So I'm going to answer this one right away here and then provide you a few details later. Can we achieve sustainable home construction step by step? First energy, then carbon and resilience. I would answer no here. And the wildfires, hailstorms, floods, tornadoes don't wait, and we risk losing entire net zero buildings and carbon negative buildings potentially, and maybe even neighborhoods in larger cities if there's new developments, if we ignore resilience. Although I have to qualify this, if we ask, could we do it step by step? Sure we could. And I think, unfortunately, that's where we're set up. But maybe I'll leave that for the discussion panel. But I believe it may take longer if we do this and be more disruptive, maybe even to find an effective way to integrate all these aspects if we did it sequentially. So here's why. I believe we may have already reached a point in some regions where increasing energy efficiency beyond the middle tiers may give us diminishing returns on GHG reductions. And I know Chris just spoke to that. So yes, diminishing returns if you're looking for the low-hanging fruit or the biggest bang for the buck at this point. I realize we have to qualify that. But we need to find a low-cost way to insulate and seal homes as well, and seal them well enough and stay carbon effective in any grid. Otherwise, homeowners will not be able to afford it on a large scale if we do that. Then resilience is maybe another example of that. As I just said earlier, we need to find ways to build homes sufficiently energy efficient and carbon wise, and for example, tornado resistant if they're, and I know Dr. Terry is doing that, and this is great that you're exploring that space as well, because that seems to be a risk. We just saw the Barry tornado recently. And so, for example, that means we can't eliminate the OSB sheathing in favor of rigid insulation in areas where they're prone to tornadoes. I could make many examples here for wildfire resilience and not eliminating non-combustible materials as cladding, for example. So builders and renovators need to be aware of the local climate risk and account for it in the construction of the homes and buildings they build at the same time. And so maybe the best available carbon materials already offer solutions here. I could quite see a few. We need to include that in our analysis so that we can say, you know, low carbon, if this climate risk exists, then maybe this choice rather than that one. The next one is we need to find a sweet spot where all aspects of sustainability are addressed in home construction: energy, carbon, resilience, social, economic, all those considerations. And then there's, of course, cost and affordability. Unfortunately, each of these measures we would like to include in homes is being conceived and discussed as a single idea through a single lens. And so, you know, everyone's thinking, let's all do this one thing and let's regulate it right away. But each of these measures together, and this is my perspective when I participate in all of these, add cost, all of them. And so besides what the market and supply chain looks like today, we need to be aware that all these new practices and concepts compete for a limited investment resource. And we may have to coach builders and renovators on how to help owners and developers prioritize, as I just said, maybe climate risk over some of the carbon or energy efficiency things. Or we find cost neutral or cost saving ideas that integrate all issues. Obviously, those are the biggest winners, right? So so back to the question, can we achieve sustainable home construction in sequence? Yes, we could, but ideally, in my opinion, we wouldn't. I think wherever possible, we should integrate everything in the most economical way and with the least amount of technical risk. And if we can incorporate resilience and estimate the carbon effectiveness while designing for energy efficiency and waste reductions and other societal goals like accessibility, all at net zero or low incremental cost, that's the sweet spot I think that we should all be looking for. One other slide to highlight this point is here, I'm trying to make is, when you look at all climate change actions, you generally find these 4 areas: adaptation, resilience, mitigation, sustainability. And many projects and programs mix and match several of these climate change actions. And I look at this table sometimes to clarify for myself the goals or the goal or goals of a project. And for today's discussion, I thought it would be important to understand all the other aspects as well. Mitigation is, of course, what we're most familiar with. Net zero builders are most familiar with that. Mitigation is the reduction of adverse effects that lead to changes in climate in the first place. So here we find anything to do with energy efficiency, GHG reductions, and so on. Then sustainability is where we talk about things like the circular economy, about recycling, reducing waste, reusing materials. The goal of sustainability is to meet our own needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. However, I guess sustainability is really a much, much broader concept that could all fit under sustainability. For example, in the context of the 17 UN sustainability goals, you could say that what we title sustainability here in this little table is really the concern evolving around responsible consumption or sustainable cities. And in turn, looking at the continuum of sustainable goals, what we're talking about today would fall under the goal number 13, climate action. So this graphic is really just a basic attempt to say that all of these goals are connected and that others are active on any of these or all of these sustainable development goals. And we need to focus, sometimes we need to focus on single lenses. Maybe that's my point. And, today that's embodied carbon. But only to integrate them into everything else. And I see from the previous speakers, from Miyoko and from Carl, that this is already happening, which is really great. So here's just it's a rich graphic just to show you the areas that I am involved in, that the tech team at CHBA is involved in, and Sonja's team. It's a kind of a heat map that talks about, where we are most involved. You see the net zero home program there. Obviously, we spend a lot of time and effort there, but you also see on that graph other areas. For example, resilience takes up quite a bit of our attention. And then you see on the sustainability and adaptation side that it's getting a little less, but it just gives you an idea of all those issues that we're involved in. And what we experience, at least for my part, when I participate in any of these groups, is that everyone's just focused on one thing. And I think the message I'm trying to make is to give here is that we need to sort of integrate all of that and maybe weigh our priorities of what we're doing in a special case, in a special project, in a development. So I'll leave it there. It's, as I said, I'm not going to go through everything. It's a rich graphic just to show you the breadth and width of the areas that we're involved in and that I think should be considered. So then let's get to this question. How can all builders and renovators make it work? What can builders and renovators do to integrate everything in their projects? First, again, I keep saying this, kudos to all of you here on the panel already making this work. It's great. And I love the implementation plan of, short-term, mid-term. And as I said earlier, I can't add much to the technical discussion of how to do this, other than to say that all of us here on the panel and probably listening, including our support networks, have to become leaders in integrating. That's maybe my message here. And so this is really what I'd like to give everyone to think about. It's a slogan from Jim Carroll, a futurist, author, and consultant. And why I'm going all philosophically is let me share an episode or like a little thing that happened to me when I was still an NRC employee presenting energy codes in 2014 at the CHBA conference in Whistler. And Tex McLeod, who some of you may know, went up to give a speech, and I was all, oh my God, here we go. Because he responded to my energy code presentation, and he said, look, people, we know how to do energy efficiency. We invented high performance homes in the 80s. We can bring this to the next level. Nobody else can. Let's get our act together on energy efficiency. And 1 year later, the CHBA launched a net zero program. And all of you have been probably aware of that or working with Sonja on that. And today we're just at a similar spot, except we're being asked to add, to account for GHG emissions, decarbonize everything, create climate resilience, incorporate climate change adaptation data, integrate electric vehicles, add battery storage, residential accessibility, and the usual bit of code changes on fire safety and structural stuff. And I thought that we needed a speech like that or a motto to remember. And so when we go through this, so when I was thinking about it, think big. It's already done because governments have taken this away for us to do. So the goals are set for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I see that Chris and all your other presentations went already to orient for those goals. The next one is start small. And again, the panelists we're talking about today have already shown that they're doing this. They're starting somewhere and then they're scaling this up, which is really the next thing. So the scale, I think, is the real challenge that we have to do. And I think that should be our focus. And that would be my contribution to say, okay, here's one thing, but let's scale this safely together with all the great ideas nationwide and affordably and in a low risk setting so that residential construction can benefit from all of this. And so the question should be, how can we enable every builder, contractor, subtrade, everyone's listening today, every building official, supplier, manufacturer, to build what Chris, Miyoko, and Carl are talking about, and also include code compliance, local climate risk for extreme events, and other societal goals like accessibility. So, and here are a few things to start us off, and maybe we can discuss some of those in the panel discussion. First one is, yes, we need to widely share simple, low risk, low cost, sustainable solutions. Those will become self-driving, transforming ideas that we all need to get this on construction sites. Next is we should also try to integrate, as I said earlier, all these single lens issues into every project. Otherwise, equally important ideas would have to compete with each other, okay? Accessibility or fire safety, we're talking about low carbon materials. Well, fire safety is traditionally with those low ignition or non-combustible materials, so is structure. So we need to talk about how to integrate them all. Use best practices guides to scale solutions nationally. And that's one, I'm not excluding ourselves here, that's definitely one for the associations and CHPA, but also for governments. Let's make sure we add all the context that we will later need for codes to be effective for 100% of the builders. Otherwise, our grade scaling curve may actually go downward because of failures and warranty cases. Then suppliers. Yeah, suppliers, everyone knows how the supply chain looks right now. So, well, if we want to double the housing supply, suppliers now need to make plans to expand to tomorrow's needs. And if the material choices are changing, we need to account for that. And also the support systems to get innovation solutions approved. That's, innovative alternative approaches. We need to make sure that they're working streamlined and smooth. And then maybe, this is a big one, all levels of government. I know some of you are listening today. All levels of governments and all departments within the same government have to coordinate the action and create together powerful coordinated incentives. And, CMHC is working on a national climate risk data portal at the postal code level. Does NRCan know about this? Does NRC know about this? Does Environment and Climate Change Canada know about this? Or do you know that Environment and Climate Change Canada is working on new targets for plastic waste reduction in construction? Those are just a few. And all of these initiatives make a lot of sense, but we need to know that government grant systems for homes and buildings are well integrated and coordinated and that they work on all of these. And then, maybe we need to coach each other to disrupt the market a little bit and maybe explain to others how we could compete on ideas rather than on price. Or think modular. I mean, maybe it's time to rethink the process. And maybe a bit of a shameless plug here. We gave a seminar a couple of weeks ago. It's available on the CHPA/modular page. It gives you an overview of the modular construction. And if I think about not using foundation, the surface mount foundation mounted manufactured homes may be great for carbon effectiveness. And then the last one, really continue to dare to try out new things. And I was very encouraged to hear what Carl and Miyoko had to say there. It was really great to hear that. And so we all need to climb this mountain together and get everyone on the industry on board, because if we lose the 90%, I think we have in the end achieved nothing. And that's the real danger here. And I think also the real opportunity. So with that, I'll leave this last slide here. I think this is the phrase we should all remember and work on. And I vow to do my part as well, and a few of these things, and thank everyone in advance for helping us to scale our best practices and get the message out to the entire industry. So Nat, Gord, thanks for inviting me to get that little pitch out here. Thank you.
And thanks, Frank. It's really cool that CHP, as you say, has picked up on our good friend Tex McLeod's comment and kind of challenged themselves. And it's wonderful. Now, folks, you do need to know that Chris needs to leave shortly. He's got a rather urgent matter he needs to look after. But Chris, if you're there still, I'd like to ask you read one quick question to you. John has asked, embodied carbon and reducing it is presented as primarily an environmental issue. Do you also consider it an economic one, in that with the cost of carbon expected to increase, developing and using low carbon materials helps to mitigate future increase in building costs. Your thoughts on that? Do we see an economic play here coming with respect to carbon?
I think possibly, and I think that, I'm so glad, Frank, that your presentation sort of, talked about that holistic lens, because I got into looking at embodied carbon of materials because I was looking for a holistic lens, and I saw this piece was missing. It's like, in our practice, we were thinking about energy efficiency, we were thinking about water efficiency, we were thinking about toxicity and indoor environment quality. Like, we already had all of these things, and I was like, there's this piece that's missing. So like, the fact that I'm talking about that piece, by no means do I see that as like, this is the thing, and we absolutely have to focus on that. And so that kind of circles around to that question, Gord, is like, yes, I think realistic carbon pricing will have an impact. There's already 2 organizations, one in the US and one in Europe, that are launching carbon credits for people storing carbon in buildings. So I think that's something that will grow and hopefully help that along, both on the sort of helping the material innovators, but also helping the architects and the builders who decide to put those materials in, and eventually the homeowners with offsetting some of the costs. But I also think one of the interesting things that came out of all of our studies is that we found zero correlation between the cost of a material and its carbon footprint. Sometimes the lowest cost option was the lowest carbon option, and sometimes the lowest carbon option was the highest cost, and it could be vice versa, and it could be anywhere in the middle. Like, there was no predictor of cost relating to carbon footprint. So I think when we're talking about what are those that low-hanging fruit, the low-hanging fruit is not just the thing that reduces a lot of carbon, it's the thing that reduces a lot of carbon at cost parity, or maybe even cost benefit. And so I think we can sort of like see a way to especially for all the sort of early kind of easy wins. Those easy wins are easy because they aren't also going to cost you anymore, or it's going to be very similar. So and I think that's builders would be able to look at the list of changes we're proposing and go, that one makes sense, that one makes sense, and I can't afford that one. So we're showing the carbon numbers, but I think any builder would be able to look at that list of changes and go, yeah, these are the ones that I could afford to do now. And that's the process that the team at Doug Terry is going through right now, and lots of others is yep, the carbon numbers are this, and I can actually do that. And I think
so. And I think we'll ask for Carl and Miyoko's input on that, of what they found for cost. One more real quick one I think you can answer. The granularity John Cooke was asking is kind of the granularity of your embodied carbon. Do they include transportation of materials, the extraction from the extraction to the factory to the site? What is that when those EPDs are done? How granular are they? How much are we actually capturing?
So we're commenting on the sort of what people call the cradle to gate emissions. So that's harvesting the raw material, getting it to a factory, and turning it into a building material. We were not counting from the factory to the job site or on-site emissions. And we don't count those, because they're a surprisingly small percentage compared to the cradle to gate. Like, typically cradle to gate is anywhere from 70 to 90% of the full life cycle emissions of that product. So, we focus on that because that's the big chunk, and also because it's really hard to assess, especially transportation to site, in any kind of accurate way. When we looked at doing it as generally as would be easy, like, here's your job site, here's a factory that makes that thing, what's the distance? Let's assume it goes by this kind of truck, here's a number. But what we found when we really started looking at it is, I traced a bag of Roxol from the plant in Milton to my Home Depot here in Peterborough. It doesn't go down the 401 in one truck, from Milton to Peterborough. It actually went 5-6 times that distance in a variety of different ways to a bunch of different warehouses. And it was like, there's no point in giving somebody an imaginary number for that transportation, especially when it's a relatively small piece anyway. So long way of saying, we're just looking at the cradle to gate, because that's where pretty much all the meaningful emissions really lie.
Thank you, Chris. And I know you have to leave, and you're welcome to stay, obviously, if you can. But we wanted to thank you.
Everybody. That was I really enjoyed all those presentations. It was this was really great. So sorry I have to run, but
thank you.
Yeah.
So I will pass to Miyoko and Carl. In your work, and Miyoko, perhaps I'll start with you. How has cost driven the elements of cost figured in so far? Would you agree with Chris that there's not necessarily a correlation between the cost and carbon?
I think we're at the point where we're looking at cost just in terms of the material swap outs to meet that near term or medium term. So I would say to get that like 50 to 70% reduction in the near term, we don't have to make choices that are going to impact us greatly on the cost side. But what I think we do also need to make sure that we're monitoring is, are these direct swap outs on all the different levels? So does it have, if it's insulation, is it the same R value? Does it provide the same protection from like air, water, that kind of thing? So there's a couple of things we use in order to evaluate the change. I wouldn't put cost as the number one thing, but it's one of the factors.
Thank you. And Carl, your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with everything that Miyoko said. I'll just add that we've also seen for certain material substitutions, it varies by geography as well. So, what we're paying for an alternative in the GTA is going to be different from Ottawa and different from Calgary. And what is the base spec and available materials in each geography as well?
It is interesting, isn't it? I was smiling when Chris was talking about the cost, and it's my experience has been in having sold products to the building industry. It's incredibly regional. Armando's from Texas, and Armando, you need to know you can buy a high efficiency furnace much cheaper in Canada than you can in Texas. And even though they're made right there in Texas, and I say that was true, may not be true today, but it was certainly true 5 years ago. So we're amazingly regional in our pricing structures. Pretty interesting. There was a quick question. It was one of the first ones asked, was from Tim from Vermont. He was asking the carbon metric of kilograms per carbon equivalents on square meter metric. And important to understand, I would say that embodied carbon would most often be representative as kilograms per carbon equivalent per square meter per year, whereas embodied carbon is a one-shot deal. That it was, you're not reporting it as a year, you're reporting it as a one-time shot. So hopefully that answers that question. Sonja, I'm wondering how you're feeling about, because Chris is saying insulation, do we really need that much? First, he talked about substitution of insulation, but then he did talk about high performance and does it really make sense to go further? Somebody asked about solar panels. Do they make sense when you're in a really clean grid from a carbon perspective? Any concerns, any worries that the net zero initiative of requiring INGO to say high performance levels of insulation get derailed a little bit by the carbon conversation?
Yeah, and we're only just starting to explore that right now. So if it's okay, I actually have a couple of screens I want to show you that we're getting a sneak peek on a report we haven't released yet. It's one that my colleague Brett has been working on. And so we're just finding some of the carbon numbers now. So the first chart I'm going to show you is exactly in what you said, Gord, is that kilogram of carbon equivalent by meter squared by year. And so what we're finding right now is just, again, we're just for the first time seeing these as well, is that it actually varies quite a bit by province as well because of what type of energy is produced by each province and so what they're using. So you can see here, Ontario has the most number of homes in our program so far, but their carbon emissions are quite low as compared to either Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, Alberta. Now, clearly they've got less homes participating. So statistically, the numbers aren't, these are just preliminary numbers. But what I wanted to show you here too is that each of the dots shows where the homes are. So Ontario's homes have been quite clustered together, but you'll see even in Alberta, there's quite a range as in Nova Scotia. So the numbers they vary quite a bit. And then once you start taking a look at the impact of the solar, so for the homes that had the solar on it, you're seeing that the impact actually isn't, if I'm reading this chart correctly, and Brett's probably on the call, but from how I read this, it's not having a very impact on those areas with a clean grid. And so those are things that we're looking at. And so now I think it would be of real interest if we could engage some of our net zero builders. Obviously, Miyoko has already started to do some of that work. And since Doug Terry Homes has the most number of homes in our program, it'd probably be a great case study to work with them to take a look at exactly what kind of impact the additional material is to get to these higher levels of performance in terms of that embodied carbon, but then again, also the offset of the renewables, because we're seeing some builders now, which is interesting, the production builders are not choosing to go full net zero. They're choosing to put a smaller array on their home. So they're only offsetting some of the energy with the on-site renewables rather than going all the way to net zero, which may actually end up being a good thing. We're not sure yet. So there's a lot of questions we still have and that we still need to look into. And as always, we work with our builder partners to dig deeper into these types of things as we start exploring it.
Thank you. And then Chris had asked, with new carbon taxes, are they applied to the material manufacturers? And the thought would be, and he's assuming yes, as would I. And then he's suggesting that would impact the cost because if the carbon taxes go up. So I think that's a fair statement, Chris, not so much a question as a statement. Bridget's asking, and again, this may be to Sonja, that we use the term net zero energy, and now we think about net zero carbon. Is it going to be, do you foresee a carbon label from CHBA? I'm asking you, I guess, or do we see a carbon label from somebody else? And do we change the name of it? Your thoughts, Sonja?
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible. The management committee at the Net Zero Council have been asking this question for a few years now. And as we noticed here in the presentations, there's such a wide variety of tools. What we're still trying to figure out is if all the tools are coming out with different answers, which tools should we be using? So which one's accurate? So there's still a lot of groundwork that needs to happen before we can adopt anything with any kind of certainty. But I mean, I don't know if we'd even need to change it. If we just stuck with NZE, it could be, instead of net zero energy, it could be net zero emissions if we wanted to embrace the embodied carbon piece as well. So I don't know that we'd necessarily need to change the name, more so just the definition and what it is that we're actually measuring.
I'll say, for example, in the US, EPA is thinking about a net zero emissions label, not a carbon label, but an emissions label, which is an interesting challenge, right, to think about that. So that's pretty interesting. And Patrick asked early on, and Chris did answer, but I think it's important to bring it up to the group. You know, the rationale for using 20 versus 30 versus 50 years when calculating that carbon use intensity, I think is pretty interesting. What we want to do is create that sense of urgency on this call, right? That it is a 20-year thing, that we need to think about not 50 years from now, not 30 years from now, but sooner rather than later, I think is really the metric. So thanks for asking, and I just want to put that on everybody's thought. It means most of you on this call will still be active in the industry in 20 years, and we got to get this done before. So Frank, you and I may be retired, I don't know, but I would like to say within our lifetime this gets done. So that's why we're going to use 20. I'm going to be around for 20 years, so let's do it in 20 years, is maybe the way we do it. So I wanted to bring that one up. And then Frank, given your experience out of this whole metric, how do you feel, because you've had interaction with manufacturers and you have members, CHBA members that are manufacturing members, how do you see them responding at all? What have you seen? You worked in the wind industry and others. Can you give us some thoughts on the manufacturing side of the business?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've had only a few conversations directly with suppliers or manufacturers, and some of them are obviously aware, but how far they are planning and how widespread those solutions exist yet. For example, to look at producing insulation with renewable energies. I think Owens Corning is planning something like that, but it's not a widespread, ready, available solution. So that comes back to the regional readiness, the regional availability, and maybe economies as well, of how quickly that can be scaled. So that's why I put them on my scale. I think the manufacturers are a critical piece in that of readying us to get there in time, because if we're shifting material selection and swap out things, that needs to be part of the discussion of, will those manufacturers be ready to supply all that? And I can maybe add there, I know that NRC, for example, is entering into research projects to research on new materials. For example, adding more recycled plastic in materials, and potentially looking at new material types that we don't know, or material types that are not currently used, but that would be better in the carbon equations. And that's why I put also the material approval systems that we currently use to get this safely into the market on my list of scaling up, because that's the way we get to find out if something has a CCMC report number, or ICCES, or I think APA does that too. Anyway, so all those are in discussion, but I haven't seen any major movements.
And I would encourage everybody on this call, either ask for EPDs if you are using products, and if you are making products, start producing EPDs. Miyoko and Carl, I'll give the last comments to you, and they'll have to be quick. We only have a half a minute left or so. But there is some thought in the call, on the chat, or the questions. Rick was saying it's a little frustrating. You do your best, you sort out all the garbage, and then you find out it all went into one infill, one lot. And then you hear folks talk about this carbon calculator is going to give you a different answer than that carbon calculator. Does the uncertainty bother you guys at all? You're still forging ahead. Are you good with that uncertainty? Miyoko, how long do you think it's going to take to get answers sorted out?
I can't answer how long it will take, but I will say, I know there's also, Terry wrote a question in the chat too, or more a comment. I totally understand just a hesitancy and a concern for implementing any targets before we have sufficient information. But I would counter to that without providing everyone with information, like doing some of this prelim work, working with Chris Magwood, working with the tools, just having a look, without that information, we can't use that to create those targets or to create realistic targets. So without more participation from the industry, I would say, that's really when we start to have these unrealistic targets implemented. So I really would encourage more people to start exploring this. It doesn't have to be on every model. It can be on, one prototype, working with someone who's qualified, just getting an idea and sharing that information.
Thanks, Miyoko. Great answer. And Carl, your thoughts?
Yep. As Frank said, start small. Start with one home, one lot, and sort of feed off that discomfort. Right? Like you might not get it right the first time, but you've got to try, and you can't be afraid to make mistakes along the way. Right?
Thank you. And we do need to finish off and say thanks. I will say on the exam, you're going to find 4 new acronyms. You're going to find CUI, you're going to find EPD, you're going to find BEAM, you're going to find MCE. You're going to have to get familiar with all of those folks, all of those elements, folks, and think about just got used to gigajoules, and now you got to think others. So there's work to be done. Thank you all so much. Frank, Sonja, from CHBA's perspective, great partners in the industry. Carl and Miyoko, as you say, builders on the bleeding edge, looking for others to take on some of the pain. Really appreciate that. And all of this brought to you by Enbridge. Isn't it I still think it's the coolest thing that Enbridge, I've known now for 25, 30 years, always willing to step up and say, hey, let's just provide good information to the industry, and watch, of course, for future sessions. And in fact, I need to put that up quickly. This last 2 slides, my apologies. I have 2 slides to show, and Stacy would be mad at me if I didn't show. So if you're not already on our digest list, please sign up today, and the link's in the chat window so that we can send you up-to-date information. And then keep looking for additional series. We are doing one on water management and enclosures on June 23rd, and then on June 9th. Well, I think that one's been changed perhaps, but the application, the natural gas application system that is changing from a provincial perspective. I think that one's being changed, Stacy, if I'm not.
Yeah, I was gonna tell you, Gord, that we were getting all the graphic stuff figured out, and I realized I hadn't given you the update one, but I am going to make sure I include an updated PDF with this resource email, just because of the confusion that's happened, so people go and select the right date.
Thank you. So again, Stacy, anything I've missed that you'd like to say?
Well, I'm just seeing that Miyoko is answering Terry's question in the Q&A, and if I end the webinar, it won't record Miyoko's answer. So Miyoko, if you don't want to answer that, okay, I think she's off now. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't cutting her off before she answered the question there.
And thanks again, folks, for our speakers, and thanks everybody for listening in.